Stop being overdramatic, my sister scoffed as I clutched my chest. My mom rolled her eyes and said I was just looking for attention. But when the doctor read the scan, the entire family's face turned white, and suddenly everyone went silent. I, 32M, was called overdramatic while having a heart attack. Here's how I made them all pay. I collapsed against the kitchen counter, my left arm going numb as a vice grip tightened around my chest. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, radiating from my sternum down to my jaw. My vision blurred at the edges. My sister glanced up from her phone and rolled her eyes. She told me to stop being so overdramatic and that I was ruining her birthday dinner. Again, Mom was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like garlic and herbs, and she didn't even turn around. She just sighed heavily and said I always did this. Always found some way to make everything about myself. I tried to tell them something was seriously wrong, that this wasn't just indigestion or anxiety. The words came out strangled and weak. My sister laughed and said I should have pursued acting instead of accounting because my performance was Oscar-worthy. She went back to scrolling through her phone, probably posting something about her special day. Dad was in the living room watching television. He shouted through the doorway asking what all the fuss was about. My sister called back that I was having another one of my episodes and seeking attention as usual. He grunted and turned up the volume. I slid down to the floor, my back against the cabinet. Sweat poured down my face despite the air conditioning running full blast. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I managed to pull my phone from my pocket with trembling fingers and called for an ambulance. The dispatcher asked me questions I could barely answer through the crushing pain. My sister noticed and asked what I thought I was doing. I told her I was calling emergency services because I thought I was dying. She scoffed and said I was taking this too far, even for me. Mom finally turned around, spatula in hand, and said I was being ridiculous and wasting everyone's time. She reminded me that we had reservations at the nice Italian place in an hour, and I was going to make us all late. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. They rushed in with their equipment, asking rapid-fire questions about my symptoms, my medical history, any medications I was taking. They got me on a stretcher and hooked me up to monitors that beeped urgently. One of them said my heart rate was dangerously irregular and they needed to move fast. My family watched from the kitchen doorway, annoyed expressions on their faces like I had just ruined their evening on purpose. My sister muttered something about me always needing to be the center of attention. Mom asked the paramedics if this was really necessary, if they could just give me something for anxiety and send me on my way. The lead paramedic looked at her with barely concealed disgust and told her I was likely having a cardiac event and every second counted. They wheeled me out to the ambulance as my family stood there in stunned silence, finally processing that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't faking. At the hospital, they rushed me straight to the cardiac unit. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, barking orders, inserting IVs, prepping me for scans. The emergency room physician examined me quickly and ordered an immediate CT angiogram. She said my symptoms were textbook myocardial infarction and they needed to see what was happening in my coronary arteries. My family showed up about 40 minutes later. I could see them through the glass partition, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the sterile hospital environment. They had missed their dinner reservation. My sister kept checking her phone, probably fielding messages from friends asking where she was. The scans came back within the hour. The cardiologist came to my bed with a tablet showing the images. His expression was grave. He explained that I had an acute coronary syndrome caused by a nearly complete blockage in my left anterior descending artery. The widowmaker, he called it. I had been minutes away from complete cardiac arrest. If I had waited any longer to call for help, I would be dead. He asked if my family was present, and I nodded toward the waiting area. He went out to speak with them while nurses continued monitoring my vitals and preparing me for emergency catheterization. Through the glass, I watched his mouth move as he showed them the scans on his tablet. I saw the color drain from their faces. My sister's phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Mom grabbed Dad's arm to steady herself. They came into my room looking like they had seen a ghost. None of them could meet my eyes. My sister started to say something, but her voice cracked, and she stopped. Mom touched my hand lightly, her fingers cold and trembling. She whispered that she was sorry, so sorry, she had no idea. Dad stood at the foot of the bed, looking older than I had ever seen him. The cardiologist returned and explained the procedure they needed to perform immediately. He would thread a catheter through my femoral artery up to my heart and place a stent to open the blocked artery. The risks were significant, but doing nothing meant certain death. I signed the consent forms while my family watched in silence. Before they wheeled me away to the cath lab, my sister grabbed my other hand. Tears were streaming down her face, and she kept apologizing over and over. She said she should have listened, should have taken me seriously, should have been a better sister. I looked at her and said nothing. Just looked. Then they took me away. The procedure took 2 hours. When I woke up in the cardiac ICU, groggy and sore, my family was there. They had pulled chairs close to my bed and were sitting vigil like I might disappear if they looked away. The anger came then, hot and sharp, cutting through the medication haze. They had almost killed me with their dismissiveness and contempt. Over the next 3 days in the hospital, they visited constantly, bringing flowers and cards and apologies that felt hollow and too late. My sister canceled her birthday celebration entirely and spent hours sitting beside me in silence. Mom kept touching my face like I was 5 years old again. Dad talked about mortality and regrets in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. But I remembered. I remembered collapsing in pain while they mocked me. I remembered my sister scrolling through her phone while I struggled to breathe. I remembered Mom more concerned about dinner reservations than her son dying on the kitchen floor. The apologies couldn't erase those memories or the fundamental truth they revealed about how little they valued me. The cardiologist explained that my condition was partially genetic but had been exacerbated by stress. Chronic, unrelenting stress that had been building for years. He asked about my home life and work situation. I told him about my job as an accountant at the family business, the company Dad had built from nothing and expected me to run someday, despite my complete lack of interest. I told him about always being compared to my sister, the golden child who could do no wrong. I told him about years of being dismissed and minimized and treated like my feelings were inconvenient obstacles to their perfect family narrative. He listened and then said something that changed everything. He told me stress could kill me just as surely as genetics, that I needed to make serious lifestyle changes or the stent would be just a temporary fix, that I needed to remove major sources of stress from my life or I would be back in his cardiac unit within a year. It was a prescription for radical change. I was discharged 5 days after admission with a medications list as long as my arm and strict orders to avoid stress, exercise regularly, eat better, and attend cardiac rehabilitation. My family drove me home and fussed over getting me settled in my apartment. They had cleaned everything and stocked my refrigerator with heart-healthy food. They meant well, but it felt suffocating. That night, alone in my apartment, I made a decision. The doctor had given me permission to save my own life, and I was going to take it. I opened my laptop and started writing my resignation letter from the family business. Then I drafted another letter, longer and more detailed, explaining exactly why I was stepping away from all of them. The next morning, I called my attorney friend and asked him to review both letters. He read them over the phone and was silent for a long moment before asking if I was sure. I told him about the heart attack, about dying on the floor while they laughed, about the cardiologist's warning. He said he understood and the letters were legally sound. He offered to be present when I delivered them if I wanted support. I accepted. I scheduled a family dinner at my parents' house for the following Sunday. I told them I wanted to talk about the business and my recovery plan. They were eager and relieved, probably thinking everything would go back to normal now that the scare was over. Sunday arrived cold and gray. My attorney friend picked me up and we drove to my childhood home together. The house looked exactly as it always had, perfectly maintained and utterly joyless. My family was already there, gathered in the dining room around the table set with Mom's good china. They looked surprised to see I had brought someone, but welcomed us both politely. We sat down and Mom served pot roast that I could barely eat given my new dietary restrictions. Small talk flowed around the table, forced and nervous. My sister asked about my cardiac rehab sessions. Dad mentioned a new client at the firm who wanted to discuss succession planning. After the plates were cleared, I pulled out the 2 letters from my jacket pocket and placed them on the table. The room went quiet. I told them I had something to say and needed them to listen without interrupting. I started with the resignation letter. I read it aloud, every word carefully chosen and rehearsed. I was stepping down from the family business effective immediately due to medical necessity. My cardiologist had been clear that stress was a primary factor in my condition, and continuing in my current role would likely kill me. I was exercising my right to prioritize my health and survival. I had already contacted the company attorney to ensure a smooth transition, and my shares would be placed in trust per the operating agreement. Dad started to object, but I held up my hand. I reminded him that he had asked me to not interrupt, and I needed the same courtesy. He closed his mouth, jaw tight. Then I read the second letter. This one was harder. My voice shook, but I pushed through. I detailed years of being dismissed, ignored, and minimized. I reminded them of specific instances where my feelings and needs were treated as inconveniences. I talked about the impossible standards I was held to while my sister was celebrated for basic achievements. I described what it felt like to be dying on the floor, while the people who were supposed to love me most accused me of seeking attention. I explained that the heart attack had been a wake-up call in more ways than one. It showed me that my family's treatment of me was literally killing me, and I could no longer afford to maintain relationships that damaged my health. The cardiologist had prescribed removing major sources of stress, and they were the biggest source in my life. I told them I was going low contact indefinitely. They could reach me through my attorney for business matters. For personal matters, I would check a dedicated email once a month and respond if appropriate. I would not be attending family gatherings, holiday celebrations, or casual visits. I needed space to heal both physically and emotionally, and I could not do that while maintaining our current dynamic. The silence after I finished was absolute. My sister was crying quietly, mascara running down her face. Mom looked like I had slapped her. Dad had gone red, the way he did before explosive anger, but he seemed to be holding it back with visible effort. My attorney friend spoke then. He introduced himself formally and explained that he was present to ensure the conversation remained civil and to witness that I had clearly communicated my boundaries. He stated that any attempts to violate those boundaries could be considered harassment and would be documented. He was calm and professional and absolutely unmovable. Dad found his voice first. He said I was being dramatic and vindictive, that families work through problems together, that I was letting one bad moment define years of love and support. I looked at him and asked what love and support he was referring to. The love when they mocked my pain? The support when they told me I was ruining my sister's birthday by having a heart attack? Mom started crying then, ugly sobs that shook her shoulders. She said she had made a terrible mistake and was sorry, and we could fix this. I told her that her mistake had nearly killed me and some things couldn't be fixed with apologies. That I needed to focus on not dying, and I couldn't do that while managing their guilt and expectations. My sister tried to speak, but couldn't form words. She just kept shaking her head and crying. Part of me felt bad for her, but the larger part, the part that remembered her scrolling through her phone while I collapsed, felt nothing at all. I stood up then, and my attorney friend stood with me. I told them the letters would be officially delivered by courier the next day for their records. I asked if they had any questions. None of them could speak. We let ourselves out and drove away while my family sat frozen around the dinner table. Update 1. The following weeks were simultaneously the hardest and most freeing of my life. The courier confirmed delivery of the official letters on Monday morning. My phone exploded with calls and texts from all of them. I blocked their numbers and forwarded everything to my attorney as promised. Mom tried to visit my apartment twice. The first time I didn't answer the door. The second time I called building security and had her removed. My attorney sent her a formal cease and desist letter after that. Dad attempted to leverage business connections to force a meeting, but my attorney had anticipated this, and our separation agreement was airtight. My sister took a different approach. She started seeing a therapist and sent me updates through the designated email, respecting my boundaries while still trying to communicate. Her messages were raw and honest. She acknowledged specific instances of her terrible behavior, not just the heart attack, but years of casual cruelty. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, just told me she was working on becoming a better person. I read them but didn't respond. The business transition was rocky but professional. I had been meticulous about documentation over the years, so my replacement, an external hire, had everything needed to step into the role. Dad was furious about bringing in an outsider, but the board supported the decision given my medical documentation. My shares continued generating passive income that I didn't need, but accepted as compensation for years of undervalued labor. Cardiac rehab became my anchor. 3 times a week, I went to the hospital facility, and worked with other survivors who understood what I had been through. We exercised under medical supervision, attended nutrition classes, and participated in support groups. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who took my health seriously. I made friends there, real friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. There was a former teacher who had his attack at 45 and completely restructured his life afterward. A small business owner who sold her company and retired early rather than work herself to death. A father of 3 who learned to set boundaries with his demanding extended family. Their stories resonated in ways my old social circle never had. My health improved steadily. The weight I had been carrying, both literal and figurative, started to drop. I changed my diet completely, discovered I actually enjoyed cooking when I wasn't doing it to please others. I started walking every morning, then jogging, then running short distances under my cardiologist's supervision. My medication doses were adjusted downward as my body healed. I also started therapy. My rehab counselor recommended a psychologist who specialized in family trauma and medical PTSD. The first session was brutal. She asked me to describe the heart attack, and I broke down describing my family's reaction. She didn't minimize it or suggest I was being too harsh. She just listened and validated that what had happened was deeply traumatic and my response was healthy self-preservation. Through therapy, I began understanding patterns I had been blind to for decades. The parentification that started when my sister was born, and I became responsible for managing everyone's emotions. The scapegoating where I absorbed blame for any family dysfunction. The conditional love that required me to sacrifice my needs for theirs constantly. I had been so deep in it that I thought it was normal. For months after the heart attack, I started dating someone I met at a coffee shop near the rehab center. She was a graphic designer, creative and independent, and completely unconnected to my old life. When I told her about my family situation on our third date, she didn't push me to reconcile or suggest I was being too harsh. She just said she was proud of me for protecting my peace and asked how she could support my boundaries. It was such a foreign response that I almost cried right there in the restaurant. This is what healthy looked like. Someone who respected my decisions and didn't try to manage my relationships for their comfort. 6 months post-heart attack, I had my follow-up appointment with the cardiologist. He reviewed my test results and broke into a huge smile. My cardiac function had improved significantly. The stent was functioning perfectly. My cholesterol was down, my blood pressure was normal, my stress indicators were the best he had seen. He said whatever I was doing was working and to keep doing it. I told him about cutting off my family, and he nodded thoughtfully. He said he had seen similar situations many times, where people had to choose between family and survival. He was glad I had chosen myself. He reduced my medications further and cleared me for more intensive exercise. On my way out, I thanked him for saving my life twice, once with the stent and once by telling me the hard truth about stress. Update 2. The 1-year anniversary of my heart attack fell on my sister's birthday. The same day, I had collapsed in my parents' kitchen. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I spent the morning in meditation, processing how far I had come and acknowledging the grief of losing my family, even though it had been necessary. My girlfriend suggested we do something celebratory to mark my survival. We went hiking in a state park I had never visited, something that would have been impossible a year ago. I made it to the summit without chest pain or shortness of breath. Standing at the top, looking out over the valley, I felt more alive than I had in decades. That evening, I checked the designated email for the first time in weeks. There were several messages from my sister, continuing her updates on therapy and personal growth. But there was also one from my father that made my blood run cold. He had been diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was poor. He wanted to see me before starting aggressive treatment, wanted to make amends, wanted me to come back to help run the business during his illness. The email was manipulative in its desperation, cycling between guilt trips and appeals to family obligation. I showed it to my therapist at our next session. She asked how I felt about it, and I was honest. I felt angry that even facing death, he was trying to manipulate me into serving the family's needs over my own. I felt sad that we would never have a genuine relationship. I felt guilty for not feeling worse about his diagnosis. She asked what I wanted to do, not what I should do or what a good son would do, just what I wanted. I told her I wanted to maintain my boundaries because they had saved my life, and I wasn't willing to risk my health for someone who had nearly killed me through neglect. I responded to Dad's email through my attorney. I expressed that I was sorry about his diagnosis and hoped his treatment would be successful. I also stated clearly that my boundaries remained in place and were not up for negotiation regardless of changing circumstances. I would not be returning to the business or resuming family contact. I wished him well, but our relationship was over. The response was predictable. Mom sent dozens of emails calling me heartless and cruel. My sister's messages took on a desperate edge, begging me to reconsider, saying Dad was dying and I would regret this. Extended family members I hadn't heard from in years came out of the woodwork to tell me what a disappointment I was. My attorney fielded it all and sent cease and desist letters where appropriate. I blocked the new numbers and email addresses. My girlfriend held me while I cried angry tears about the unfairness of being painted as the villain for refusing to self-destruct to make them comfortable. Dad's health declined rapidly. My aunt, his sister, respected my boundaries but sent occasional updates through my attorney so I would know what was happening. The cancer was aggressive and treatment was failing. He had months at best. I struggled with guilt despite knowing intellectually that I was making the right choice. My therapist reminded me that you can love someone and still protect yourself from them. That obligation doesn't override self-preservation. That I didn't owe my abuser's forgiveness just because they were dying. 3 months after his diagnosis, my aunt sent word that Dad was in hospice and asking for me. I sat with that information for a week. My girlfriend didn't push either direction. My therapist asked what young me, the one who had collapsed on the kitchen floor begging for help, would want me to do. I decided to visit, but on my terms. I went alone, during a weekday morning when I knew the rest of the family would be at work. I told the hospice staff I was there to see my father, but wanted no other family present. They accommodated my request. Dad looked small in the hospital bed, diminished in a way that was startling. The cancer had stolen his vitality and left behind a fragile shell. But when he saw me, his eyes sharpened with the old intensity. He started to speak, but I held up my hand. I told him I had come to say what I needed to say, and then I would leave. He could listen or not. But this was for me, not him. I told him that I had spent my life seeking his approval, and it had nearly killed me. That the stress of never being good enough, of always serving the family's needs, had manifested as a blocked artery that stopped my heart. That I had chosen to live, and that meant living without him. I told him I didn't forgive him for the years of casual cruelty or for laughing while I died on the floor. That forgiveness required remorse and changed behavior, and he had shown neither. That I hoped he found peace, but I would not be sacrificing my peace to give it to him. He tried to argue, to explain, to justify. I let him talk himself out, and then I stood to leave. As I reached the door, he called my name, his voice weak. He said he was sorry he had failed me. Just that. No excuses or qualifications. I turned back and looked at him. I told him I accepted his apology, but it didn't change anything. Then I walked out and didn't look back. Dad died 2 weeks later. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent flowers with a card that said only rest in peace, and spent the day hiking with my girlfriend. My therapist said that was healthy grief, honoring the loss while protecting my boundaries. The estate was messier than expected. Dad had made last-minute changes to his will, leaving me a larger share than my sister in what my attorney interpreted as a final manipulation attempt to assuage his guilt. I worked with my attorney to equalize the distribution because I didn't want his money to be another chain binding me to them. My sister sent one final email after the estate was settled. She said she understood why I had made the choices I made, and she was sorry for her part in pushing me to them. She hoped someday I might be willing to have a relationship with her, but she would respect my decision either way. She was continuing therapy and working on being better. She wished me happiness. I read it several times, and then I did something I hadn't done in 18 months. I responded. I told her I appreciated her respect for my boundaries and her genuine work on herself. I wasn't ready for a relationship, but I was willing to keep the email channel open for updates if she wanted to continue sharing her growth. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was an acknowledgement that people can change.